Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of Europe's premier addiction conference. It's wonderful to, well, I can't see anyone because I've got bright lights in my eyes, but it's wonderful to see so many people here. I have dramatic news that unfortunately one of our speakers this morning isn't here. John Kelly was getting ready to board his plane. Getting ready to leave the house to board his plane a couple of days ago, and his back went, lifting his luggage to come to the conference. So let that all be a warning to you to be careful when you're lifting your luggage, because it's a dangerous thing. Who knew that that video that they make me watch at work about lifting a box was useful? But it turns out it is. The good news is that John is a true professional, and he has recorded his presentation. And so we still have his presentation for you. We just, unfortunately, don't have John in person. So I'm delighted to welcome you to this session on reimagining recovery. I am so grateful to the conference organisers to allow us to showcase addiction science in the form of recovery. And I think this has been an element that has been missing from the academic programme at this conference for a few years. And we have a fantastic programme today. My name's EdDay. I'm an addiction psychiatrist working in the West Midlands in England, and I'm also the president of the Society for Study of Addiction, which owns the journal Addiction and part funds this conference. And I'm also the UK Government National Recovery Champion. And what is a National Recovery Champion, you may ask? Well, I asked the same question myself. This post came about in the 2017 drug strategy, the government drug strategy. And this was one of the big things they announced, that they wanted a recovery champion. To be honest, the job description was a bit vague as to what a recovery champion did. And it was even more vague when they didn't appoint anyone to it for 18 months. But when I came into this role, what I understood about what I had to do as a recovery champion were these two key things. The first thing I had to do was try to ensure that our government only delivered evidence-based practice. And the second was, and this was the challenging one, to try and bring everyone together in the addictions field in the UK to work as one. And this is where the recovery part comes in, because there were certain political elements 10 years ago or more who wanted to pitch people in the addictions field against each other. And this became a harm reduction versus abstinence battle. One of the most pointless battles there has ever been, but one that seems to rumble on all the time. So I saw it as my job to ensure that we got rid of that battle, that we actually started working as one to try and counter the real problem, which was addiction and the stigma that goes with addiction. So whenever I talk about what I do, I always show this slide, first of all, to reassure people. So this is where I'm coming from when I'm talking to policymakers and to clinicians and to researchers, I suppose, as well, in the UK, in that I talk about the spectrum. We're dealing with a spectrum of issues here. So when we think about any form of substance or other behavioural addiction, we have at one end of the spectrum people that abstain, don't use the substance, or use it in a perfectly harmless, socially acceptable and pleasant way. At the other end of the spectrum, we have people that develop really significant problems, problems that they find impossible to control and that slowly destroy all aspects of their life. And of course, in the middle, you've got every other variant of that spectrum. So if you have that range of problems, you have to have a range of responses to tackle it. And that's what's at the bottom of the screen here. So we need everything from population-level education through early intervention, primary prevention and early intervention, treatment, and then recovery. And that's really what I want the focus of what we want to talk about today. So I'm setting this in the context of how I see this. And I'm just going to give you a quick policy overview in England to set the scene for the other two presentations we've got today. So when I talk about this, I always emphasize the recovery-orientated system of care. So this is my one drum that I keep beating whenever we talk about this. And this comes from the well-established idea of the last 20 years that addiction is a chronic disease. Addiction's a chronic issue. It's not an acute problem. And we know that in medicine, over the past century or more, we've become extremely good at treating acute problems. If you have a broken leg, you can fully expect to go to the hospital, have it treated effectively, and within a matter of weeks be back to full functioning. But of course, as we've gradually got rid of most of the acute care problems and got them under control, so people live longer, and so chronic disease becomes the main issue of healthcare services. And that's where addiction sits. And chronic care needs a different model of healthcare. It needs a partnership working model where the clinician is a guide and a supporter and a motivator rather than necessarily the expert with all the answers. In order to manage a chronic condition, you have to take a lot of the responsibility yourself, and it's a day-by-day process. So we talk about recovery, and we talk about the fact that for some people, recovery is possible, but requires quite an extensive process in order to get there. The one that isn't generally provided by acute treatment, which tends to be time limited and focused on perhaps remission or just abstinence. Now we see recovery, this is the UK definition of recovery. This came from the UK Drug Policy Commission over 10 years ago. And this sees the concept of recovery. Now recovery often just gets conflated with abstinence, but that's not how I understand recovery. Recovery involves two elements really. One is control over your substance use, so remission. The amount of substance or the behavior is now under your control. It might be that you've done that through complete abstinence, but it might not. The second element, which is perhaps the important bit, is that you need good quality of life. You could become abstinent from alcohol by never leaving your house, never speaking to anyone, never going online. You wouldn't come across any alcohol, you wouldn't drink any, but you would have no quality of life. So recovery is about maximizing health and well-being, and also the full participation in the rights, roles, and responsibilities of society. And those two elements now, when we're thinking about research in this area, are increasingly to be thought of under the rubric of recovery capital, which you'll hear more about in these presentations this morning. So recovery from severe addiction can take a long time. It's a process that requires a lot of work. There's no one way of doing it. There's multiple, in fact, every individual has their own individual path to recovery. So there's no one way, no one method that works. But when, in the most severe cases, it undoubtedly requires hope and aspiration, and it always, in my view, involves connection. The opposite of addiction is connection, as you'll often hear. And one of the key roles of helping people out of active addiction into recovery is connecting them to other people. And repairing connections they've lost and forming new connections. So in the UK, or more particularly in England, so apologies for those not steeped in the complex issues of the UK, but the UK obviously is made up of 4 separate countries. I'm going to be talking about England here because Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland have their own processes here. But in England, way back when we had a relatively stable government that had been there for more than 12 months, we had a review of our drugs strategy. And this was done by Dame Carol Black, an eminent physician in the UK. And she ended up looking at, she was asked by the Home Office to look at the criminal justice aspects of the drug issue. And the report she delivered just before the first COVID lockdown was absolutely damning about the government's performance on it. So 10 years of austerity in UK politics had meant that the situation was out of control. Drug deaths were at the highest level they'd ever been. We'd got drugs pouring into the country. We've got cocaine use going up. We've got use going up in all aspects of the population. It was a major problem. So a second review was commissioned to look at the treatment services, and this was delivered in August 2021. And I was part of this review and worked quite closely with Dame Carol, and I was pushing my recovery-orientated system of care as how we were going to move forward to develop our services. So this diagram, and apologies, it's impossible to represent a complicated 3D issue in 2 dimensions, but this is my best go at it. So this is how I see things. On the far side of the screen, in the green colours, is the treatment system as we have it. And we've done lots of work in the UK looking at the different stages of the treatment system, how you need different strategies to attract people into services and engage them, then different elements that help them change behaviour, and then different ways of sustaining that behaviour. And there's lots of different well-established, professionally run elements in the UK treatment system for that. But my argument was that that's insufficient, and most people, when they leave that system, still require a good bit of ongoing work, support, which might last, as you'll no doubt hear from John Kelly later, up to 5 years of support before you get to stable recovery. And that support is often delivered in a completely different way, by what's broadly called the recovery community. And this is where we had an issue, because what is the recovery community? How can you define that? How can you, how can you show policymakers how they can commission and develop a recovery community? And the way we've done this is two ways. Firstly, to think about LEROs, so lived experience recovery organisations. These are peer-led organisations that deliver many of these services. But most importantly, I've tried to couch this in the language of evidence-based medicine. So each of those blue boxes on the near side of the screen to me are areas of recovery support where there is an emerging evidence base, and quite often at least one randomised controlled trial in that area. So I've couched this as a system has to have all of these elements in it. The arrows going from this side to the other side, to the far side of the screen, are really important, because I don't ever believe that anyone's recovery is a nice, straight, linear process moving through all these stages. Of course, it's much messier than that. People go round and round, and the recovery support side and the people with lived experience are valuable in all parts of the system. They're the cement that binds the different blocks together. But this diagram's been really important to get people to think about the full system and to try and break down some of these debates about harm reduction and absence. We want both harm reduction and absence. We want all of it for the best quality system. So my ideal model would be acute care plus potential medical stabilisation if that's what's needed, opiate agonist treatment, long-term recovery management, and recovery support services. And of course, full acknowledgement that at the bottom of the screen there are plenty of people that don't go anywhere near treatment services because they use mutual aid services like the 12-step fellowships, or they recover entirely through their own work. So this diagram is really important. And when the government launched its new drug strategy, so the 2021 drug strategy, which came out at the end of last year, these features were enshrined in it. So these were the menu of interventions that the Department of Health has then rolled out from that strategy, that it wants increased funding that's rolled into the services must deliver on all these different areas. And you'll see at the bottom of the screen, enhanced recovery support is in there. Now, this is really important because I talk a lot about parity of esteem for lived experience recovery organisations in this process. I don't believe for a second that people with lived experience and those organisations should be running the whole system, but I believe that they have a clear place within the wider treatment world. And so now we have enshrined these different elements of treatment, these different evidence-based recovery support services are now laid out as being required in each area of England as the treatment system moves forward. Now, I'm very grateful for this slide to the Department of Health and the Office for Health Improvement and Disparities, who did a survey earlier this year of commissioners of our treatment services in England, and they got a response rate of about 60% of them to try and find out how they saw the system at the moment. So the current requirement with new money rolling in is that they deliver recovery support services. What are they doing already? And this diagram shows you the extent. So at the far side, you've got peer-based recovery support services, which you can see sort of 70% of commissioners say they already exist in their treatment system. Through to, this side, educational recovery support in education and university, which is very rarely delivered. And you can see the split between where this is done by exclusively lived experience organisations in orange and professional services in blue. And there's a mix between both of those. But what's really interesting is, so this shows you where we're at in the UK and how far we've got in delivering some of these elements. But the caveats to this slide are that it's very clear when you read what these commissioners are telling you, they don't fully understand what these services are. They both over and underestimate how many they have. And they're also not really clear what a lived experience recovery organisation is. So we have a lot of work to do, and I just emphasise those two elements. So the most common one they talk about, peer-based recovery support services, I think of And we're currently writing guidance to support services in England to deliver these interventions. But I think of 3 levels of involvement of people with lived experience in our services. So we have what I call lived experience advocates, who are people who are receiving treatment at the moment, possibly still in addiction, certainly not abstinent, but are working as advocates for others within the services, possibly delivering naloxone, harm reduction interventions, engaging people, bringing them to appointments, that sort of thing. We then have a category that I call peer support workers, who are often in early recovery, whether that's abstinence or remission, and they would work as often greeters, linking people between different elements of the service, taking people to meetings, running with support, running groups in our services. And then the third tier is what I'm calling the recovery coach, where you take someone with quite a bit of lived experience, often 1 or 2 years of abstinence or certainly control, and then you give them training to maximize their ability to deliver their lived experience knowledge to people in active addiction. So this is one element that we're looking to try and define and develop training and sort of role specifications in England. The other area I just wanted to mention is the other end of the spectrum. So I mentioned universities and university students. And the reason I have this slide in here is because this is my university in Birmingham in the West Midlands in England. And I was struck when I came into this role that in the US, there are over 150 collegiate recovery programs. So 150 universities have a peer support, university-supported program for students abstinent from any form of addiction. And when I looked around, there was just a single one, a fledgling one in the UK at Teesside University. So I set about trying to start this program at the University of Birmingham. We're now into our 2nd year. The program is called Better Than Well. And just to give you a flavour, this is almost a recovery support system in microcosm within a university. So when I looked at the university, it turned out there was pretty much no support for students in this situation. Students were terrified of mentioning that they had any form of, even if they were in abstinent recovery, they were terrified of mentioning, certainly drugs, to the university for fear of being thrown out. And quite often universities reinforce this with an attitude that went something along the lines of, this is a zero-tolerance campus, so we don't need services like that. We don't have any drugs on this campus. And that's a standard argument that gets brought out by lots of universities. So we started this program, and the key elements of it on the far side of the screen is we have a weekly celebration of recovery meeting where we invite anyone in abstinent recovery or anyone that's interested in learning about this to come to the weekly meeting. We do 12-step, smart recovery and other forms of mutual aid meeting on campus. We have a drop-in service. So my project manager is a student in long-term recovery who runs a drop-in service right at the heart of the campus. We develop individual recovery plans for students. We run sober social activities, and we're starting to help them develop community service projects where they can give back to other people. So these are the sorts of recovery elements that the evidence suggests are really powerful. As we go on, we're developing other elements. So we also provide learning support to students because students, after a period of active addiction, often struggle to negotiate the complexities of a university campus. And then we also do events where we try and educate the wider campus and public education events about addiction and recovery to try and break down this stigma and this lack of understanding about what goes on. The other element that we've also added is recovery housing. So we now have a flat within the university accommodation, which is a recovery flat. So one of our students with 7 years of abstinent recovery is the sort of flat manager. He lives there and he supports other students living in that accommodation. You could apply to that when you came to the university. And I was delighted in the summer between the last year and the new term that we had our first student contact us to say he'd chosen the University of Birmingham because he was in abstinent recovery and we had this program. So I'm just winding up here. The final slide I want to leave you with, I've summarized for you some of the issues you're going to hear about in the next 2 presentations, and I've shown you how they sit in the current system in England, which is evolving quite quickly as we go along. Let's probably what you could say about our government, actually, but it's evolving almost as quickly as the government changes. But the one element that perhaps we haven't cracked yet, and this is where the research agenda comes in, is how do you measure the progress of this work? So if we were to introduce these elements, how would we evaluate them, and how would we determine whether they're making a difference? And I'll just leave you with this last slide, which is about the concept of recovery capital and the idea that this can be used as a way of measuring progress. So you have two examples. You have the assessment of recovery capital tool in the middle of the screen there, which looks at these different elements of individual, social and community capital. And then you have the RECCAP instrument, which I know David Best has presented at this meeting before, which is an app-based tool for capturing that information and demonstrating to an individual, feeding back in a visual form how they're progressing in those different areas and enabling them to set goals to achieve, to boost their recovery and overcome barriers to recovery. So that's a bit of a tempter about where we might be going, but this is one of our challenges now in the UK, is how to add this to our existing national drug treatment monitoring system, which rather sort of stops when someone leaves professional treatment. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to introduce John's presentation. Now, I very much hope someone is going to start John's presentation for me. So John Kelly is, I mean, it's devastating that he's not here, because no one has done more in the world, sort of academic world, to provide and build the foundation for the evidence base for recovery support than John. So John is the Elizabeth Spaulding Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard University Medical School, and he's also the founder and director of the Recovery Research Institute. And if he doesn't mention it in his presentation, I can't remember whether he does, I would definitely look up Recovery Research Institute, because what they've done there is an amazing tool for disseminating recovery-related research. But John's going to talk about, the title of his presentation is Recovery from Culture to Science. And what he's going to do is give us a foundation of the history of how we've moved into a science of addiction recovery. So fingers crossed, the presentation will now start.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. John Kelly. I'm really sorry that I cannot be with you in person due to health reasons, but I am delighted to be able to produce a video, which I hope you're able to hear clearly and see clearly this morning. I'm very sorry I can't be with you. I was looking forward to this conference for the last 6 months since I knew I was going to be welcomed as a part of the proceedings. I was really delighted to be invited, and I want to thank the committee and Dr. EdDay for putting on this symposium and for hosting this focus on addiction recovery. Over the next 30 minutes, I'm really going to talk about tell you the story as I see it over the last 50 years in a condensed version of how we've really arrived at this science of addiction recovery during this last 50 years, and why we are where we are now in terms of this focus. So let me give you a brief roadmap. As I mentioned, I'll talk about why we are where we are now in terms of how did we get here. I'll talk about the active ingredients of recovery, what we're understanding about what those may be, and also the processes of recovery and milestones and services that people may need in terms of who needs what, when, for what duration, at what intensity, to help support remission and long-term stable recovery. So how did we get here? Well, we are all here this morning, of course, and at this conference because of these reasons: the terrible burden of disease, disability, premature mortality that most middle and high-income countries around the world faced related to alcohol and other drugs. These are endemic, intransigent challenges that we have faced for many, many decades, particularly, of course, in the last 50 years. I've been looking at this 50-year focus in part because last year was a 50-year milestone in the United States since the initial declaration of the war on drugs under Nixon, which marked a really concerted national focus and policy initiatives to address these endemic problems in the United States. But really this was reflected around the world with an update, an amendment to the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, which was ratified in 1972, and to which 186 nations now around the world have signed on to. But again, it was an international focus on really recognizing and trying to address these endemic problems related to alcohol and other drugs. Now, we've learned a lot, of course, about what seems to work and what doesn't seem to work. Human beings are slow learners, that's for sure, and it's not been easy to arrive at the best possible solutions to address these problems, these public health issues. And of course, these have not always been viewed as public health issues, and this has been a constant challenge, of course, in our field, is how best to address them, and should they be addressed through criminal justice lenses or through public health lenses. I think we have shifted in the last 50 years towards a broader public health viewpoint on addressing these problems, away from criminalization, and this has been, I think, a welcome approach. We have learned a lot, of course, from the clinical and public health side as a result of the appropriations by various governments, including the United States, which have really focused on understanding the true nature of these disorders and why they are so pervasive and intransigent oftentimes. Particularly, of course, two factors have been really clearly uncovered in the last 50 years, and that is the etiological factors and the impact in the brain. I think when we look back over the last 50 years, we've really learned a lot about the genetic components that these are multifactorial, developmentally oriented disorders, but they have strong genetic components, as well as impacts in the brain neurocircuitry, which of course affects people's ability to regulate the impulse to use a substance despite severe and harmful consequences. This, of course, is why these are psychiatric illnesses, why they are classified as psychiatric disorders, because of their involuntary nature. Ultimately, they don't start off like that, but they become involuntary, of course, to the point of premature mortality, where you have an organism with a propensity for life of roughly 80 years, has a malfunction, a biological malfunction, and can self-destruct, poison itself to death roughly 30 years earlier than Mother Nature intended. And we've learned a lot about, therefore, the causes, genetic and otherwise, as well as the impact in the brain. But not just that, we've learned a lot about the epidemiology, the risk factors in the population and the environment, which are protective or increased risk for these disorders. We've also learned about the pathways into, through, and out the other side of these disorders. And we've learned a lot about different kinds of treatments and interventions. Related to that, of course, in terms of the clinical course and what kinds of interventions may be most helpful at different phases, we've learned a lot about the timeline. So, and this is really just highlighted here in terms of the clinical course of these disorders. We know they have a long clinical course, typically, for people with severe substance use disorder, that is to say, what we might call addiction or severe substance use disorder. And this timeline highlights this clinical course. You can see on the left-hand side, it takes about 4 to 5 years after the onset of a substance use disorder, severe substance use disorder, before people start to seek formal help, whether that's from a treatment facility or a mutual help organization. That's quite a long time, of course. That's partly to do with a fear of discrimination, if they do, from employers or other people in the environment. But once people do start to seek specialty care, it can take many years to get into remission. And this is highlighted in the middle segment here. From studies that have been done, it can take up to 8 years after seeking help to get that first year of full sustained remission. So that's quite a long time. Again, that's an average in adult clinical samples. So these are severe end of the spectrum, and about 4 to 5 treatment episodes before people are able to achieve that first year of full sustained remission. What's also noteworthy on the right-hand side here is that 5-year marker. That's the number of years it takes on average before the risk of meeting criteria for a substance use disorder in the following year drops below 15%. Why 15%? Because 15% is the annual risk in the general population of meeting criteria for an alcohol or other drug use disorder. So to be no more likely than anybody else in the general population of meeting criteria in the following year for substance use disorder, if you've already had it, takes about 5 years of continuous remission after you have achieved that initial year of remission. So these, of course, tend to be protracted illnesses. They tend to have a chronic relapsing course. So that's what people talk about, of course, that these tend to have a relapsing course. But the good news is most people do eventually recover. As you can see on the right-hand side, something like 60 to 75% of people who meet lifetime criteria for SUD will eventually get into sustained remission. That's the good news. The sad news, of course, is what we're faced with every day, which is the premature mortality, all the chaos and heartache and suffering that goes on in those intervening years. But the question, of course, is, can we speed this up? Are there things that we can do to increase the time it takes to initial and sustained remission? I think we can speed this up if we do a number of things. One of the things that I think we can do is to attend not just to the clinical pathology, but also to the environmental conditions which people face every day outside of that initial treatment phase. I think I often use this analogy, this metaphor of a burning building to describe the kind of the addiction crisis that we've all been faced with in the last 50 years. I think if we've done one thing right in the last 50 years, we've recognized that we have a crisis, that the building is on fire and we need to put the fire out. Now, we have necessarily expended a lot of time and energy, of course, on doing just that, putting the fire out. We've got to put the fire out first before we can start to rebuild the building and make it fit for purpose. We've spent a lot of time, therefore, on detoxification, on stabilization, on acute care treatment. 90% roughly of the clinical trials that have been conducted in the last 50 years have been 12-week trials. They have been short-term clinical trials, and then the treatment is removed and we follow people up for a year and look to see what happens. We've done a less good job at really stopping the fire from restarting. And also, very importantly, providing the building materials that people need to rebuild their life and the scaffolding that people need to rebuild their life. So these can be classified as the building materials or recovery capital or recovery resources that people need to often rebuild their life or even get started in their life. I think very importantly also, from a criminal justice perspective, is the building permit. Is oftentimes people are denied a building permit to get started to rebuild their life in recovery because of a prior criminal conviction. And these create huge barriers for people that can really remove their sense of optimism and hope for the future just by virtue of the fact that they've had a criminal conviction in the past related to their drug use, which prevents them from getting a loan, from getting housing, from getting back into education or the workforce, the very things that ingredients that people need to be able to build hope and optimism for the future. So these, of course, are things that need to be addressed. In Portugal, of course, has been a leader internationally in terms of decriminalizing drug use to help people overcome that barrier, not to burden them with criminal records due to their due to drug use. I think that is a welcome move that can remove that to help people move into recovery sooner without that impediment. And as I mentioned, we can think about those building materials as recovery resources or recovery capital, kind of the building materials, the scaffolding that people need to rebuild their life. And these come in different flavors, of course. There's the internal factors, the motivation, the ability, the self-efficacy, the competence and confidence, as well as the social resources, the financial and cultural resources or the availability in the community of different aspects that people need. Why is this important? It's important because recovery is really a reciprocal process. It's a biaxial process. And there are two factors involved in recovery as they are in addiction. And what I'm talking about here is the fact that substance use disorder remission naturally results in increases in recovery capital. Once you get a little bit of remission under your belt, you start to get better mental health. You get better emotion regulation. That recovery capital, of course, can start to, going the other way, can help to sustain that remission. The other thing that we can do to affect the likelihood of ongoing remission is to provide more recovery capital, those building materials, the building permit, the scaffolding, because that can actually reduce the allostatic load, the biobehavioral stress, which is very prevalent and pervasive in the early weeks, months, and even years for some people of recovery. And this undermines, as I'll show you, this undermines people's change attempts to be able to move forwards in their life in recovery. So I think we can speed up this process to initial and sustained remission if we attend not just to the clinical pathology, not just to the detoxification, stabilization, 12 weeks of manualized treatment or pharmacotherapy, but rather to extend that, to look to see how we can change the environmental conditions, build the scaffolding over the long term so we can start to build optimism, hope, and resilient remission. So what are the ingredients of recovery? I think a useful model, this has been criticized to some degree, but I think it's still a useful model when we think about the stages of change. Why is this important? Why is it useful? I think it's useful because it helps us delineate what kinds of services might be helpful to different people at different stages of change. For example, when people are in these pre-contemplative and contemplative stages of change, oftentimes we can still help in the continuum of care by providing harm reduction services that can offset premature death, disease transmission, overdose, and other adverse events which occur as a result of exposure, chronic exposure to substances. As people become more ready and able and willing to move past their substance use, we can engage them in services that can help them do that. So it's not just a matter of being ready, willing, and able, but also attending to, as I mentioned, tending to the environmental conditions. We often think of addressing these needs, the motivation of somebody through, for example, motivational interviewing, to get them ready to make a change, an adaptive change, and equip them with the skills that they may need through CBT, for example, that can attend to the motivation and ability. But what's also often missing is the neglect of the difficulty of the different environmental circumstances that people face, and also how long they are or will be exposed to those difficult circumstances. And that's captured here by that difficulty and difficulty over time. After all, you can have, take the Olympics, you can have two identically motivated and capable high jumpers. But if for one of those high jumpers, the bar is much higher, then it makes it much more difficult for that person to succeed, again, even with the same motivation and ability. So these environmental conditions are so key to address. One way to think about this is through, let me make another analogy to other kinds of organisms and how they recover from disease and illness. Take plants, for example. We know that plants, genetically identical plants placed in different environments will have very different outcomes. And photosynthesis, of course, is one of those processes, very important processes, that can make all the difference to the likelihood that a plant will survive or thrive or die. I think of recovery as a kind of psychosynthesis, in that it's very important that the human organism is placed in the right environment, the right type of environment that is conducive and supportive to the human organism's healing and recovery. And you can think about this as being comprised of these ingredients, these active ingredients, the social environment, of course. You can think of that as the soil through which other ingredients may be absorbed. Activity, physical activity, just building physical health and robustness is key. Also, things like employment and engagement in educational activities. Nutrition, just eating regularly is a big deal early in recovery, and then hopefully introducing antioxidants and other kinds of nutritional balance that can aid, again, the human organism's recovery. All of these feed into really the ability of the human organism to regulate emotion. This is both a consequence, but also we can directly address emotion regulation through active interventions like cognitive therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. And you can see here on the right-hand side that this spells this, makes this acronym, handy acronym of a saner approach, a social activity, nutrition, and emotion regulation approach to recovery that can help the human organism, again, through the right conditions, can help the organism recover and heal. When we think about these conditions, of course, we often think about, we can instill optimism, we can instill hope psychologically, but there's a psychobiology, of course, underneath the hood, as well as the psychological and emotional aspects. There's another biological aspect that's going on at the same time, which accounts for change. And there is a neuroscience to recovery capital. Social factors are very important in recovery for many people because they see those role models and that support that they get from peers or from family members, often both, that can really help motivate them, continue to provide them with accountability and encouragement, cheerleading, and all the kinds of things that people need to continue this very difficult change process. When we think about the four main reasons, for example, why people use a substance, it's to feel good, to feel better, to do better, and because other people are doing it. I think it's really ironic that those are the four same reasons why people stop. To feel good, to feel better, to do better, or because other people are not doing it. So what was once the best thing ever in solving all my problems now becomes the top priority to get rid of. It was the top priority every day. Now it's the top priority I got to get it out of my life. People lead me into, I got lots of role models that lead me into and can role model the drug use for me, but I also need the benefit of those on the other side, people who are not doing it. And this is a very common process, of course, of what happens in recovery. And these social environmental agents and agencies are key for oftentimes in recovery. Now, we've known now for a long time that social factors are key not just to mental health. Instinctively as human beings, of course, what do we do when we're upset? We tend to talk to each other. We tend to confide in each other, look for support. Now, there's a psychology and a psychobiology to that. We also know that social support not just affects our mental health and mental well-being, but also affects our longevity. It's a risk factor for premature mortality, the absence of social relations. Think how important these things are as human organisms, as primates, in the course of our own lives. And Julianne Holt-Lunstad here, in this study of 148 studies, really showed that social factors are as important as things like tobacco smoking in terms of longevity. So that's how significant they are in terms of our lives. They're also critically important in offsetting these very pervasive risk factors for relapse and recurrence of the syndrome of substance use disorder in recovery when people start to make change attempts. And this is really explicated by these two major factors which undermine recovery. That is to say, this hypersensitivity to stress early on. When you remove the substance, there's a hypersensitivity, residual hypersensitivity to stress, and a down-regulated capacity to experience normal levels of reward. That's a terrible combination, which of course undermine people's attempts to get and stay in remission in these early phases. Now, we do know there is a science and a neuroscience to these social factors, which we're beginning to understand, the processes, the neuroendocrine factors, which are responsible for this social support in offsetting that allostatic load and that burden and sensitivity to stress. Not just the stress, but also reward. Look at the magnitude of the relationship here between social support and the ability, capacity to experience reward. You see a very strong linear relationship here, as well as social status. social status you can think of as resources, the recovery capital I was talking about. So the ability, the access to resources that people have. If you have more access to resources, you tend to have higher capacity to experience normal levels of reward. What does that mean? Those D2 receptors in the brain, which are responsible for mediating that experience of reward, are protective against relapse to substance use. The higher the levels of these innate reward capacity, the lower the chances of relapse to substances. So in other words, providing access to resources can boost social support and social resources and other resources can therefore boost these neuroendocrine factors and these neurobiological factors that so pervasively can undermine attempts to recovery. Now, this is why, of course, there has been this national in the United States and now international growth of recovery support services, which are socially based services. We have a multitude now of these, which are growing rapidly around the world because they match well with the undulating course of these, an unpredictable course of these illnesses. We are, of course, not just talking about 12 weeks or 3 months. We're talking about the first 5 years of instability, of elevated risk for people, even when they achieve that first year of full sustained remission. So we need resources that are available, that are accessible, that are flexible, that are enduring, and that are low cost or no cost. And these resources that have emerged and grown over the last 50 years and even longer in terms of mutual help organizations, really the grandparent of all of these services, have been very important. There's now an evidence base emerging, really supporting their clinical and public health utility. This was a review that we did, published in the Cochrane Library on Alcoholics Anonymous and 12-step treatment, conducted by Marika Ferry, Keith Humphreys, and myself, really showing, demonstrating the utility of systematic clinical linkage to these indigenous, ubiquitous recovery support services, in this case, Alcoholics Anonymous, for severe alcohol use disorder. These are people with severe addiction problems coming into treatment, systematically linked to AA relative to CBT or some other kind of intervention, produces 20 to 60% higher rates of remission across up to 3 years post-intervention. This is good news for public health. Not only that, it reduces healthcare costs to the tune of $10 to $15 billion when we extrapolate this to the US population alone. So linking patients to these free ubiquitous indigenous recovery support services, in this case, AA for alcohol addiction, can produce higher rates of remission at a substantially reduced healthcare cost. That's good news. That's the kind of combination that we're looking for in different societies. That's why I think about these resources as like AA as the closest thing in public health that we have to a free lunch. How do they work? We're also discovering how these recovery support services confer benefit. This looks very much like the kinds of mechanisms that are operating in formal treatment, except these resources, in this case, Alcoholics Anonymous, has been shown to mobilize adaptive change, that is the adaptation to the demands of recovery, by mobilizing, helping to change the social networks of individuals, that in turn produces changes in cognitive behavioral coping, self-efficacy, motivation, reduces impulsivity, reducing craving, increasing spirituality, which can be a way for people to cope with stresses using different frames of meaning and purpose. So all of these things have been shown to be effective. Now, not everyone, of course, wants to go to AA, and now there is an emerging evidence base for other kinds of mutual help organizations and indeed other kinds of recovery support services. I use this metaphor, which I think is a useful one to understand the importance and significance of expanding the repertoire of options, the menu of options that people can choose from. The question I often pose to audiences is, do fitness centers keep people fit? And the answer, of course, is, well, yeah, of course they keep people fit if you go and if you work out regularly. You're going to get fit, physically fit. The challenge, of course, for fitness centers is how do you get people to come back, right, and stay connected to these services in the fitness center? So what do? When you walk into a fitness center, you don't just see 40 different 40 treadmills standing in front of you. You see 40 different kinds of classes, 40 different options that are available, pools, courts, swimming pools, all kinds of dance classes, yoga, fitness equipment to try and get people engaged in the process of physical fitness, a lifestyle of physical fitness. Do mutual help organizations work? Yes, they work if you go and if you work the program of those mutual help organizations. We've been restricted historically just to principally 12 steps. Now we have a vast array of different options and recovery support service options. This is good news because we want to attract and engage people in the recovery process that's more in keeping with what they might choose and prefer. It's not a question, therefore, of relative efficacy. It may be true that AA is better. It may be the cross-trainer of recovery in terms of addressing all kinds of needs. But if nobody's working out in AA, but they're willing to go to a smart recovery program or a LifeRing or some other program that may or may not be relatively efficacious, it still gets them involved. And what we're finding in other studies is that people often use a multitude of different options. We've got people, for example, going to smart recovery and AA for different reasons. So there is an evidence base now emerging across these different recovery support structures, showing not just effectiveness, but also cost effectiveness in mutual help organizations, like I've mentioned regarding AA, but also recovery housing. Very large magnitude benefits for recovery housing effects that also produces very high cost savings to society. In this case, over a 2-year period, people randomized to recovery housing had not just higher remission rates and lower criminal recidivism and higher employment, but reduced cost to society of $30,000 per patient over that 2-year period. We're also seeing these recovery community centers growing all around the United States and in different countries. You can think of these as one-stop shopping for recovery, providing a variety of the building materials that people need to access to be able to rebuild their life in recovery. And we're finding also that the way these work is in keeping with their initial purpose. That is to say, to provide recovery capital that in turn boosts these other indices that promote ongoing remission. So the goal really here is to connect the dots. In different societies, this is what is happening. We have more expensive clinical services, less expensive and more enduring, available, accessible, low-cost recovery community services. We need to connect the dots, to stitch the fabric together so that we can produce higher rates of recovery capital and positive change. Again, by instilling hope and optimism and reducing that allostatic load and biobehavioral stress by providing access to resources. Now, just to finally end up, I just want to mention the process of recovery. And, you know, we need to know about milestones because we need to know who needs what type of service, when in their recovery, for what duration, at what intensity. Now, we've done a national recovery study, and this is what recovery looks like in the general population of people in recovery in the United States. We see these big changes, year-on-year changes, positive changes in quality of life and functioning, happiness and self-esteem, year-on-year over time in recovery as people are longer and longer in recovery, and decreases in psychological distress. That's the line coming down from the top. It's not the same for everybody. So in terms of who needs what, we're finding that people with, for example, with opioid use disorder start off at a distinct disadvantage early in recovery relative to other substance use disorders. They are more marginalized, more stigmatized, have lower quality of life and recovery capital, and likely need different kinds and more types of services. People who are sexual minorities also are at a distinct disadvantage, not just early in recovery, but right across the 40-year horizon of recovery. What about in terms of the dynamic aspects of recovery? We're also learning that the needs of people over time change, of course. And look on the right-hand side here, for example. You just zoom in on the first couple of years of recovery. What happens here is that there is an initial period of convalescence in that first half of the first year, which diminishes in the second half of the first year. Interesting. People start to do well, they start to stabilize, but then there's a drop before there's a improvement again at the end of the first year. What do you think's happening here? I think what might be happening from this burning building analogy is that in the second half of the first year, after that initial convalescent period, when the fire is out, this is when the smoke clears out of the building, and an accurate appraisal of the damage is done. So people looking around them and say, oh my God, look what I've got to clear up. They look forwards and they say, look what I've got to make up. Those two thoughts can be very daunting in the early phases of recovery. This may be what is happening here, this kind of dawning of reality here. Now, what can happen? People can lose hope here, or they can gain hope, depending on what's available to them. If they have access to the recovery capital and recovery resources, they can start what I call the industrial resolution. That is a resolve to get busy to rebuild their lives. And most people that I work with are ready to do this if they can have access. They're not demoralized by having a lack of a building permit or lack of resources. And this can then lead to ongoing recovery and growth. So in summary, in the past 50 years, there's been a number of different criminal justice and public health policies approaches implemented, which have resulted in different types as well as numbers of casualties in the population. We've learned a great deal about the causes, impacts, risk factors, pathways, clinical course, and remission of substance use disorder. We understand much more clearly now that there is a long and undulating clinical course, but it is modifiable. And if we can attend both to the clinical pathology and the environmental conditions, we're onto a winner in terms of increasing the chances that people have for remission and stable remission. And that is to say, a kind of personalized medicine or personalized recovery to understand who needs what, when, for what duration, at what intensity. And finally, we're seeing now this growth in other kinds of services, a menu of options that can meet the needs of people over time. And these are going to vary over time. Thank you for having me. Thank you for listening. And feel free to reach out to me at my institution via email to any of these slides or any of the papers. Thanks so much for having me. And I'll pass it back to Ed. Thanks so much, everybody.
Wow. Well, that worked well. Fantastic. You don't know how relieved I am that worked well, because otherwise I was delivering that presentation. I mean, I hope that brought across the wealth of work that John's done in this area, looking at recovery and looking at the evidence for recovery support services. If nothing else, it reminded me I must update my fire safety training. So I'm delighted to present our second speaker, who is going to carry on this conversation and move it beyond just the treatment sphere and look at how recovery can be envisaged in the wider community. So Professor Charlotte Colman is a professor of drug policy and criminology at the University of Ghent in Belgium, and she's going to talk about it takes a village from recovery to recover from drug addiction. Charlotte, I'll hand over to you.
So I hope this works. Okay, so good morning, everyone. I'm Charlotte Colman. This conference brings together a diverse audience. I see people from practice, prevention, treatment. I see people from policy. I see people from scientific communities and civil societies. We are diverse, but we have at least one thing in common. We want to improve the lives of people in recovery because we hear daily stories, recovery stories of hope, but also of despair and frustration. When I started my PhD and when I collected stories for my PhD, it's almost 12 years ago, I looked at people and people told me their life stories. And one of the stories was a story of Peter. Peter, he was 55 when I first met him in 2010 on a summer's day in the city of Antwerp, and we were sitting in a shabby office. And he was telling me his life story. He told me how he started using drugs when he was 10 years old, how he became a daily heroin user and dwelling the streets of Antwerp by the age of 20. But that day, that summer's day in 2010, he was happy, proud, and optimistic because he was in recovery for more than 5 years. And he told me, I choose to be alive. I would like to grow old peacefully without drugs and without living on the streets. And I saw Peter a couple of times, and he was doing quite well, and he was happy. He made plans for the future. And then I wanted to contact him, I think it was almost 1 year later on, and I couldn't reach him. He didn't pick up his phone. There was nothing, there was only silence. And a few days later, I went to Antwerp, and I encountered one of his friends, and he told me, Charlotte, Peter, he relapsed, and unfortunately, he died of an overdose. And we know from research, it's something that Dr. Day and Dr. Kelly told us earlier, most people who get addicted to drugs, they eventually recover, but it takes time. We know from research that it could take more than 5 years to reach a stable phase of recovery, and still relapse is possible after these 4 or 5 years. But we see that the chance to relapse, that it decreased significantly. We also know that recovery happens, that we can explain it by a combination of 3 factors: the personal factors, the social ones, and the community. And today, I will focus on the role of the community because we know from stories like the story of Peter that there is a very big difference between willing and wanting to change versus being able to change, getting access to those recovery capital resources in our communities. Because recovery, it happens in our community, it happens between people, it is something between people. When I started working at the university, I had the opportunity to attend a conference in Santo Domingo. It was a huge conference in a huge fancy hotel, Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, but it was in May, and May is raining season, so we had 3 days full of rain. But regardless of the weather, it was a tremendous, interesting conference because I met the most wonderful people there. We even became friends. And one of those friends was Caroline Cooper. And Caroline, she studied how Native American tribes deal with recovery. And she told me that those tribes, to them, the health of the community is only as strong as the health of its individual members. And when someone from that community gets on the wrong path, they intervene as a community. So they focus on the strengths, they don't focus on the risks. And this is quite different from how we in my Belgian community deal with people who are in addiction or in recovery, and maybe this is something similar that you also see in your communities. We focus on risks. We focus on what a person did wrong and will be doing wrong again in the future. We see that people in recovery, that they face stigma, they face exclusion, discrimination. Surveys tell us that citizens, and we know this because of household surveys, so surveys to a bunch of citizens, and these citizens, they respond that they want to help, that they support people in recovery, but on an abstract level, not on a personal level. Because when it gets more personal, they are reluctant to help. For example, more respondents agreed than disagreed to the question that they don't want to live next to someone in recovery from drug use. And more employers agreed than disagreed that they don't want to hire someone in recovery, although that person is fit for the job. So in other words, there is NIMBY, not in my backyard. We have sympathy for people in recovery as long it doesn't get personal. So the question is, how did we get there? We get there because of a bunch of reasons, but 2 reasons could be a lack of knowledge, because we know from research that people are stigmatizing other things that they are not familiar with. When there is less knowledge, there is a bigger chance to have stigmatizing attitudes. A second thing could be a lack of resources in our communities. We have a lack of resources to include and invest in building capital, social capital, in bonding capital. And what's also obvious in cities and communities is that often only the negative consequences of drug use are visible, like people dwelling on the streets, intoxicated, or abandoned needles in the park. And as a city, you are going to invest your resources to make those negative consequences invisible, rather than making the positive news, recovery, make it visible. Make it visible. This is what we plan to do. And with we, I mean, in the first place, Professor David Best and I. Professor David Best, he is an expert in addiction and recovery. And in a second phase, we work together with Milka from Serbia and Derby University and Stuart Green from the UK. And what we plan to do is an inclusive recovery cities action plan. So first of all, we focus on the city level because a lot of people who are in recovery, they come back to our cities, and cities can be the perfect breeding ground, our seedbed for hope and building a sustainable future for people in recovery. And our action plan consists of a few things. First of all, some theoretical principles, because it's not a new thing. So I'm just going to build further on the work of Dr. Day and Dr. Kelly. So basically, we're going to bring together some theoretical principles like SHINE, which is about connectedness, hope, identity, meaning, empowerment. We're going to focus on recovery capital resources, because we know from research that those resources are crucial to first start recovery and to sustain recovery. This is about employment, housing, sport, recreation, treatment, but also access to inclusive, active citizenship. And basically, what we want to do, we want to create those recovery-oriented systems of care Dr. Kelly about, but on a city level. So imagine that you are living in a city and you want to transform your city in an inclusive recovery city. What do you have to do? We made an action plan with, there are several steps, but I'm just going to explain 3 steps. So the first step is that you implement a council. It's an inclusive recovery council, and this is a core group of people living in your community that want to make the change, that want to take the lead to transform the city into an inclusive recovery city. These could be employers, public organizations, prevention workers, treatment workers, working together with people in recovery. This is the core group. And then this core group is going to do 2 things. The first thing is the fact that they're going to make a mission and a vision. How do we see our inclusive city? Some cities will focus on quality of life for a specific target group, while others will see it bigger. And then once you have your vision, you're going to make and draft, identify activities. And with these activities, we want to aim 2 things. We have 2 aims. First of all, we want to make recovery visible. And second, we are going to celebrate recovery. Indeed, it is about celebration, because we celebrate a lot of things in our lives. We celebrate marriages, we celebrate graduations, we even have baby showers. But we don't celebrate recovery. We are silent about recovery. But this is like a call to just celebrate it, because celebration, it involves a ritual, and a ritual, it is all about social connectedness, about solidarity, about bringing people together. And then those activities, these can be small activities, large activities, systematic ones, or ad hoc ones. It depends on the resources available in your communities. And I'm just going to give you some examples. This one is an example of Jobs, Friends, and Houses. Who's familiar with it? At least 1, 2, 3. Okay, perfect. Jobs, Friends, and Houses, let me explain it. It's a social enterprise model from Doncaster. And basically, this started as a company that helps people in recovery by learning them the skill to renovate buildings, abandoned buildings in the city. They renovate it, they get a paid apprenticeship, and then afterwards, those renovated buildings could be rented or sold by people in recovery. So it's also about recovery housing. They also focus on visibility, so they have branded t-shirts and there is a logo on the van. This is a very nice example from Doncaster. So the other was from Blackpool. Apologies, it was Jobs Transfer Houses in Blackpool. This one is from Doncaster. So these are the recovery games. And the latest edition was in September this year, and they had more than 1,000 attendees for these fun-based activities. So basically, it's about sports, bringing people together and to have fun during that time. This time, it was a water-based activity this year, and they just celebrated together. And then next week, we will start in Ghent, my city. So Ghent decided to become an inclusive recovery city, and they have included their mission and vision and actions in the Ghent drug policy plan, which is a good thing because now it's implemented in policy and you also have resources available because it's implemented in that plan. And next week we have our kickoff. So basically it means that we will inform the citizens of Ghent about the plans that we have in the city. We are going to explain what recovery is about. So it is more about the visibility and the knowledge. And then we will also tell them our activities for the upcoming years. So in 2023, we will have 2 activities. The first one will be a career dating. So we will match employers with people in recovery because we know that work, employment, that is a crucial recovery capital resource. But you can also do a very small thing, and that's changing your language because words are powerful. And with some of our words that we are using, some people on a daily basis, we can hurt people. We can change those stigmatizing concepts with concepts that help people. So basically, we can decide 2 things. We can decide to not build these inclusive recovery cities, which means that we keep recovery invisible, that we don't focus on recovery champions, that we have increased social costs, like Professor Kelly also explained, or we can decide to start building these inclusive recovery cities. We can make recovery visible, we can celebrate it. Just imagine how maybe Peter's life would have looked like if he ended up in such an inclusive recovery city. Maybe his future would have looked differently. Yes, this is our website. We have a website where we can keep you updated about the things that we are doing with inclusive cities. There's also a blog involved, and on this blog we share good practices because that's what we would like to do. We would like to set up this label of inclusive recovery cities and just spread the word of recovery, just spread the thing that recovery is possible and share ideas between several cities. And you can join us by just clicking the button below and register for more information if you want to. There is something wrong with this thing. Anyway, the thing is, to me, recovery is a co-production, and I believe that no one in recovery should walk the recovery path alone. So it would be great if you can join us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. That was fantastic. We've actually finished a little bit earlier than we anticipated, and I was umming and ahhing whether we'd attempt questions. I'm happy to give it a go if people want to try a couple of questions from the audience. Otherwise, obviously, John's not here. Now, if people do have burning questions for John, I'm happy to, he's told me he's happy to answer them by email, or you can give them to me and I will pass them on to him afterwards. But likewise, we're happy to answer questions after the session. But do we want to try a question here? There are microphones set up here. I think you'd have to come to one of those. Oh, I could have guessed who'd be the first person to ask a question. Dave, do you want to come to there's a microphone just there. Sorry, it's very hard to see with you. This is not a plant.
Well, you know I'm going to ask a challenging question, Ed, as well. But I love all the presentations. Thank you very much. And I was just looking and reflecting on Professor Kelly's analogy of the burning building, and how we need to stop it from reigniting. My question is, shouldn't we really be looking upstream? So when there is a fire, there's an investigation of why the fire started in the first place. So therefore, shouldn't that be incorporated into that analogy, that there's an investigation that goes on into why the fire starts in the first place, so we can stop the fire from starting and not just from reigniting? So don't we really need to go further upstream to see why this fire keeps starting?
That's a very good question. Charlotte, I don't know whether do you have a...
Go ahead.
No, you're leaving that one to me. Thank you. Thank you. I thought that's really kind. I mean, so Dave did introduce himself there. I believe you're on the bill later on, Dave. But Dave's been part of the College for Lived Experience Recovery Organisations, and is one of the leading sort of CEOs of the recovery organisations in the UK. I mean, the question you ask is absolutely, I mean, it's fundamental. And I showed you the Dame Carol Black review that we had in the UK of our treatment services, which was about prevention, treatment and recovery. But I know Dame Carol herself was very frustrated by how small the prevention section was in the final document. And the trouble is, I think, more than anything else, this is the area that requires considerable political will to do it. I mean, it is complicated, but surely there's more we can do to prevent these issues arising in the first place. And I suspect that occurs in the areas that politicians are very keen to talk about. In the UK, we have the phrase levelling up. But I mean, the idea that we try and build a society that's socially inclusive and gives opportunities to everyone, and that to me is fundamental to those sort of issues. And we can only demand that of our policymakers and our politicians, I suspect. Whether they'll deliver on it, again, it's just a lot of it is about advocacy and about keep making this point and referring to the evidence and building the evidence base around prevention is also important. I mean, it really strikes me, Dave, actually doing the recovery community work in universities and working with young people of sort of in the UK, mostly 18 to 21 being the university age. I was sceptical whether I'd find many students that were identifying as being in abstinent recovery at that age. But there are, and what really strikes me is how potentially working with them in this early phase may change the whole course of their life completely. I think if you're, for example, at university and you've got a university degree, that's a form of really powerful recovery capital. That's a gateway to higher earning jobs and a better future. But if you're also carrying the burden of active addiction and it eventually drags you down, it just delays the time to work. So the majority of people I'm seeing in my treatment clinic who are coming to me, say, with alcohol problems in their 40s, if we could intervene in your 20s and divert you on a different path, that might prevent the need for that happening at all. But thanks for that impossibly difficult question, Dave. I really appreciate that. Does anyone else have a question or oh, there's one at the back, yeah. Excellent.
Thank you. That was a really interesting session, and I think one of the things we're conscious about in terms of trying to shift stigma is to not only hold up recovery, but to try and honour the dignity and worth of people, no matter what state of drug use or drug dependency that they might be in. And so we know that drug dependency can be a chronically relapsing condition. How do we hold space for people, no matter where they are on their journey, whilst we're celebrating recovery? And how do we make sure that we're not accidentally increasing stigma for people who are using drugs and people experiencing dependency as we go through this.
That's a very, very good point. And it comes to the issue that I was talking about at the beginning about trying to emphasize that this isn't about abstinence being the only goal. I mean, many people, that is the choice and that is the most effective strategy, but getting there is a long journey with many stages, and we need to celebrate all the pathways to that. I think I'm keen to emphasize, and there's a large research evidence base coming out of the US now, particularly in the last 2 years, I think born out of the opioid crisis, where you've got a number of organizations that are mostly people with lived experience, maybe still on opiate agonist treatment or possibly abstinent, but are working in a variety of settings, A&E departments, court diversion systems, community outreach work, to deliver, to engage people who are at an earlier stage in their recovery journey. And I think that's what I was trying to emphasize with my 2D diagram that needs to be 3D, is that if you get this right and you don't focus on just abstinence as being the only goal, if you talk about recovery in the broader sense, the two elements that John mentioned, the remission but also the recovery capital, you can then bring those two elements together. One of the most effective ways of engaging people who haven't received any support or help and celebrating them is to link them with people that have been through that journey themselves. But we, speaking as someone working in the professional treatment system, my job is to create the scaffolding to allow that to happen and not create the incidental stigma, which I absolutely agree is a possibility. So emphasizing no one pathway to recovery and celebrating all achievements and progress is one way we can do that. And just as one final point, I'm really pleased that as part of our process, the UK government had, as an outcome for our treatment services, exiting treatment substance-free and not coming back for 6 months. That was the sort of outcome that everyone had to achieve. And lots of us have been arguing that that really is a counterproductive and not tremendously helpful outcome, because it feeds into that whole equation that unless you've just become abstinent, abstinence is the only thing we're focusing on and we're not worrying about anything else. The government is now going to change that and now bring about a range of outcomes that would be equally valuable. So any progress on that journey, any building of recovery capital will be celebrated and recognised in the treatment system. Charlotte, I don't know, yes, sorry,
yes.
Please.
May I? Thank you. I wanted to, I don't know where the person is who asked the question, but maybe to make it more concrete, because this was also a question that we asked ourselves when we were dealing with the Inclusive Cities idea in Ghent. We didn't want to increase the stigma towards people in recovery. So what we did was basically we had focus groups with people in recovery as well, but we see recovery, as you mentioned earlier, it can be a person who is still using drugs but is thinking about recovery towards people who are in recovery for more than 15 years. And we hope in Ghent that we will reach everyone, but we are very keen and we are also monitoring it very well. So we will organize these focus groups on a regular basis, and we will keep on asking the people involved, so the people with lived experiences, how they see their inclusive recovery city. Because, for example, in some recovery cities, they wear T-shirts with "I am in recovery," for example. But in Ghent, this wouldn't work, because our focus group, they told us, no, for us, this is stigmatizing, those T-shirts. So it depends from city to city, but it's really important that you involve the people with lived experiences as well, and that you indeed don't only focus on abstinence, as you mentioned.
And I'd absolutely agree that co-production as a goal in designing research would be another way to tackle that.
And in Ghent we will also focus on the idea of those recovery champions. So they are, for people who are still struggling with recovery, they are the living proof that recovery is possible. So we really want them to be involved as well.
There's time for, yeah.
Thank you very much. I do agree that people working with in the clinical setting, we always celebrate, even one move from pre-contemplation to contemplation. That is easy for us. We understand that. But when it comes to politicians and they have to decide, what does that mean to me? You have to translate that into money, what you are getting out from this. Just a simple anecdote. When we had COVID, the Minister of Health came to our residential places and he wanted to take them to use as swabbing centers and that sort of thing. And we had to prove that actually we were doing something, but we couldn't translate into money or to beautiful numbers to convince them this is worth it. So how do you change for policymakers this celebration of recovery? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I'm sure we've all had experiences similar to that. Charlotte, do you want to?
Yeah, we start at the city level because the city level is easier to make the change. So in the city of Ghent, they're fully aware of the idea of, okay, we focus on quality of life. So there are a lot of treatment providers in our city of Ghent who feel the same frustration. For example, they see a person who has an increased quality of life, but there is no abstinence, and often the funding is related to abstinence. But you also have qualitative indicators, so we don't only focus on quantitative ones, like is there drug use or no drug use, but also the quality of life is increasingly included, especially in Ghent. And I see that the city of Ghent is really aware of the fact, okay, we should move to recovery, and recovery not as a synonym for abstinence. And there is funding available in our city. And for this specific event, they work together with university, and I received funding as well. So at the city level, it's more easier to make the change.
And I think I'd just emphasize as a final point, my observation, I started off talking about having this role as a government advisor with a focus on recovery. And I think the only way to do it is, there is no one answer. So we need to use all the different approaches that we have available. So if we're thinking research-wise, quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods studies are the only way we'll do it. So the qualitative stories are very, when you have the politician in the room and you bring a personal story, as you know, as we heard from Charlotte there, that's often in the room the most powerful tool that you have to convince them. But once they leave the room and forget that, you then also need to back this up with numbers, and you have to have something that fits the current paradigm, which in the UK is very much a biomedical, sort of evidence-based, cost-effectiveness model. So hence John's work looking at quantifying some of these elements to build a story, a convincing narrative. Because I think we probably all agree, as a sort of final summary, if this session's told us anything, we've heard, I've been to sessions already at this meeting looking at the brain science model of addiction and the wonderful advances that that's brought us. But everyone always acknowledges that the social environment is also important. But I guess the reason it doesn't feature as often as the other elements is because it's really hard to try and get a handle on. And I guess that's what we're trying to do here. And I just ask you to conclude the session to thank John in his absence and Charlotte for their contribution to bringing alive the need to tackle the social environment and to start measuring these elements and bring it to the evidence base so that we can use it with politicians in the future. So thank you very much.